Hi everybody. So this is kind of a year wrap-up, year-end video on the 5-star books, my 5-star books of 2024. So a few quick kind of, disclaimers, introductory thoughts before I go down the titles themselves. But I don't typically do number ratings or whatever like that on my reviews on the channel, but I do use Goodreads mostly just to track everything I read. I kind of use Goodreads as almost like a personal diary or a personal kind of reading. I guess it's public, but like just a way to track everything I read over time. And I do put star ratings on Goodreads, not for any. I don't have like a deep philosophy around it, and I don't really put too much stock into those star ratings. I just kind of use them as a snapshot of my reactions to the books I've read. However, it is significant for me to give a book 5 stars. And I'll give a book 5 stars on Goodreads for various reasons. Mostly because it deeply affected me either emotionally or intellectually. Or it was something really new, like something that I stretched my paradigm and or something that was unexpected in a new way. I know these are subjective. I mean, this is all subjective, right? But something that really impacts me and sticks with me over time, or is very new, deeply affects me emotionally or intellectually, that's going to get a 5-star rating for me. And it is significant because I'm probably more likely to go back and reread a lot of 5-star stuff that I save on Goodreads. And part of the reason I use Goodreads again is to save it so that I can go back. And I do at the end of the year, every year, I do an exercise where I just look back over my year of reading and I look at all the 5-star titles that that I read over the year, and it gets me to reflect and think about those books and consider rereading them in the upcoming year. So that's what I just did. It's kind of mid-December as I record this. Coming up to mid-December. I'm still going to read a few more books probably in the next couple weeks, but I feel pretty confident in doing this video now. As of this recording, I've read about 125 books this year, and these are the ones that I gave 5 stars, and so I'm just going to go through. They're not all published in 2024 by any means. A good number of them are, but not all of them. So I'm just going to name each one and give just a quick kind of, here's why I gave it 5 stars, and here's what I'm currently thinking about it right now. And then at the end, I am going to name a quote-unquote book of the year. So and that will be something that was published in 2024. So I'm going to go through all of them, and then one of those titles that I name here is going to be my 2024 book of the year. So that's something to keep you watching the end, or just to skip ahead to the end if you want to know what that is. But before I jump into the 5-star books, I want to mention one book that I did not give 5 stars that I think I might retroactively give 5 stars, and that is James Davison Hunter's Democracy and Solidarity. I initially did not give this one 5 stars because of the ending. I was not satisfied with the very last section of the book. The book is broken into 3 sections. The middle section is the longest, and the middle section is just absolute gold, 5-star, excellent historical study. The last section felt a little tacked on and shoehorned into me, and it's really kind of soured me a little bit, which is why I didn't originally give it 5 stars. But I think the fact that this book has stuck with me so much since I read it, and in my view, some of that historical section in the middle in which he works through how exactly the kind of cultural grounding of our solidarity in America has been tested over time, and how we've managed to maintain it over certain crises. And how we really maybe are actually starting to lose our solidarity in a cultural sense. That is I think it's just an extraordinary reading experience to go through that middle section of that book, and it's not really like any other kind of historical/cultural theory that I've read. I think he synthesizes those areas of research extremely well, and is just powerful. It's bleak. It's also very bleak. That might be another reason I didn't give it 5 stars. It's not a very hopeful book. But goodness, it's carefully researched and really, really well argued. It's also a slow read, so don't expect to breeze through it. But man, it's really good. So that's my kind of honorable mention. I think I might retroactively give that one 5 stars the more that I've thought about it and reflected on it. But what I want to do now, having said that, I'm going to go through. This is just chronologicals. This is just as I read them. These are all the 5-star books from 2024. And I'll give some quick thoughts on why. So the first one is The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. This is a painful book to read, but it mostly gets 5 stars from me because of the writing style and the reporting. I mean, he got in the room, so to speak, with significant names in American evangelicalism and the merging of evangelicalism and politics and religion and nationalism and all that stuff. And he had face-to-face interviews with movers and shakers in that world, and he reports on it in just a really gripping way. And so I found myself, even though it was causing me a lot of discomfort and stress to read that book because of my personal experiences and all of that, and just my thoughts on, the syncretistic merging of nationalism and evangelical religion in our country, it causes me a lot of angst. But the book is so well researched, well reported, and well written, and very gripping. There are solid pushbacks to some of his, the limitations of some of his sources and all of that stuff, and whether or not he, tells the entire story. And there's good critical responses to it. But gosh, as a piece of reporting that tackles an extremely important topic in our time, and especially reading it, I read it way back in January, way before, the kind of resurrection of Trump, political resurrection of Trump, and his trajectory as a politician in the election. So anyways, it's a pretty remarkable book, if you can stomach some of the angst that it's going to stir up if you're at all like me. But yeah, I still love that book. I still think it's an extraordinary piece of journalism. So that's The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. Trying to keep this moving along. The second one is Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. This was not one I expected to like as much as I ended up liking it. And the reason... So it's a very popular level book. The subtitle is something like How We Can Reclaim, our ability to focus. Why we've lost our ability to focus and how we can reclaim it, our attention. And it smacks a little bit of like a popular science writing, which I have a little bit of a tense relationship with those kinds of books. Think like Malcolm Gladwell style. I tend to like them, but also tend to feel like they leave out a lot of things and they maybe overly simplify stuff. So I picked it up with a little bit of a trepidation, but I really, really liked it. So first of all, his writing is very, very silky smooth and very gripping. But I think the reason this one got pushed up to 5 stars for me is because of the comprehensiveness of it. So what I loved about it was he explores all kinds of cultural fact and historical factors that are contributing to our general ability to lose our sustained attention in our moment. So you're going to immediately think of social media when you look at the book, and there are a couple chapters on social media, but I mean, he covers sleep, he covers childhood, he covers diet and food. It's just a really broad look, and there's also a kind of autobiographical element that's threaded through that's really gripping. So I thought it just really was super insightful, extraordinarily well written, and it really stuck with me. And I've gone back to like passages and chapters in it, and so I loved it. Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. The third one is an old one. Those are both pretty new. But this third one is by Richard Hayes. It's called Reading Backwards. This is a biblical studies work. It's very short. One of the reasons I loved it is because it's so short, super readable. But it's one of the best examples of the kind of biblical study, biblical interpretation I like, which is more narrative and literary. And he just looks at the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he looks at them as writers who took seriously the Old Testament backdrop, and looking at it through this literary lens of like, how do they pick up on motifs and themes from the Old Testament prophets and the Pentateuch. It's just brilliant, and it's so short, and like the like insight per page ratio is really high, which is one reason I loved it so much. And it's definitely what I'm going to be going back to. So really punchy, really potent, very insightful book through that literary kind of analysis lens. Really love this one. I think it might be a little difficult to get your hands on. It might be out of print or something, but if you can find it, I highly recommend picking it up if you're interested in the Gospels and literary biblical studies. Loved Richard Hayes' work there. Okay. Oh, this one's a heavy hitter. So this author's going to show up a few times on this list. And this is The Beauty of the Infinite by David Bentley Hart. This is probably one of the hardest books to read on my list here. It took me a really long time to get through this one. And David Bentley Hart is not the easiest to read for a lot of people in general. And this is one of, in my opinion, his harder books to read, at least that I've read. So just know that if you're thinking about trying it, very difficult to read, but my word, it's outstanding. It is an extraordinary, it's quasi-systematic theology, which you wouldn't necessarily expect, but I don't know if you'd appreciate that label of it being systematic, but it is systematic in the sense that it progresses from building up an entire kind of way of approaching theology, and it's deeply, deeply Trinitarian. It's also deeply immersed in kind of postmodern, post-critical theology and philosophy. And I mean, the core of the book is beauty. So like a theology of beauty, and then exploring the Trinity as beauty, philosophically as beauty, and then kind of putting that as the ground of the entire rest of the theological project. It's just an extraordinary work. The passage, his work with even people like Anselm, passages where he talks about the resurrection of Christ and the way that he eclipsed death, all rooted deeply in that Trinitarian view that he explicates, and it's so profoundly beautiful. I'm going to absolutely be dipping back into this one, because I probably understood just a percentage of it, to be honest with you, even though I went through it slowly. But pretty extraordinary work of theology, one of the probably top 5 books of theology I've ever read in my life. So that's Beauty the Infinite by Dave Bentley Hart, who's going to show up again 2 more times, actually, on this list. Okay, so moving right along, the next one. This is a hard shift over to The Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey. Huge Tolkien person. I love Lord of the Rings is probably my favorite book. I absolutely adore the Silmarillion. I love all of that, but I also just love works about Tolkien as well. And Tom Shippey, I'd been wanting to read him for a long time. He's regarded as maybe one of the most important kind of scholars of Tolkien in terms of understanding his corpus and his impact in our culture. And so The Road to Middle-earth is an extraordinary book, and it gets a little bit more into the weeds than I was expecting on a few things, especially the philological work, like the language and semantics work that Tolkien did with myth, with ancient myths like Beowulf and stuff. But what he does in this book, he does a few things. He really explains kind of the process by which Tolkien created the mythology of Middle-earth. It's super insightful. And he also, here's what I really loved about it. He understands the critiques of Tolkien. He understands the critics of Tolkien, people who don't like Tolkien. And he does an extraordinary job responding to those critics in this book. And he does it in a way that's not polemical or harsh or kind of a harsh rejoinder. But he basically says all these critics don't really understand what Tolkien was actually doing, and then he shows you what Tolkien did, and in these ancient myths and ancient languages, and the sheer brilliance of what Tolkien was doing and the connections he was drawing to fable and fairy tale and folklore, and putting it in the world of Middle-earth, and then telling stories in that world. It's if you think like I do, all of that is brilliant, then Shippey's work only increases your respect and appreciation for the brilliance of it. And so I really love The Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey. Okay, Self-Made by Tara Isabella Burton. I have appreciated her writing for some time. I liked her earlier book, Strange Rights, but Self-Made really went up, kicked everything up a notch for me. This is a cultural exploration of our tendency to feel like we need to create our own sense of self or create our own sense of identities in our cultural moment. And she explores it. It's what I loved about this book. So I loved the writing. The writing is very, very easy to sink into, and she's very, very sharp and witty and incisive. And she also she does journalistic explorations of current events, but she also dips into historical figures, some of which were kind of historical figures a little bit off the beaten path, so to speak, with this topic. A lot of people point to a lot of the same philosophers of self, or existentialists or whatever. A lot of people point to some of the same names, but she veers into deeper territory, or at least unexpected figures that, in her argumentation, have contributed to our cultural sense of the pressure we all feel to make our own identities. And it's just a very enjoyable to read and super insightful piece of cultural criticism and kind of a little bit of journalism and reporting. And I just loved the synthesis of all that stuff. So I also just love cultural theory in general. So this is a really, really good, more accessible, more kind of popular example of someone who's really smart and has really done serious homework on those ideas. So that's Self-Made. All right, the next one is The Bible in Politics by Richard Bauckham, who's a fantastic biblical scholar in general. I've always liked everything I've read by him. And this is so I ordered this one. I was doing some preaching and teaching on the political nature of biblical texts, especially the New Testament, and earlier this year. And so I ordered this one as a resource, and I was expecting to get a big, thick hardcover tome, and it's actually a thin paperback that was way shorter than I was expecting it to be. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about Richard Hayes, about the insight per page ratio is really great. And there is an outstanding chapter, for example, on the famous text of Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And, his chapter on that is probably one of my favorite chapters on that famous teaching, or that famous gospel scene. But the whole book is really good. And if you're interested in, this is not he doesn't talk about, he doesn't try to make pastoral application per se too much to our current day politics. He more is doing a historical and exegetical work in the biblical text about what are some political, of its own time, what are some like political ramifications and implications of the Gospels of Revelation, especially. Like, it's a really, really good book. And again, that short and super insightful package. Sometimes books will get 5 stars from me because of that. They don't have any fluff or fat. They're trimmed down and really clear, powerfully insightful, and this one really left a mark for me. So that's The Bible in Politics by Bauckham. Okay, this is one that I did a full video review of, so I'm not going to belabor it here. I talked about it a lot, and that is The Lamb of the Free by Andrew Remington Riera. Go to my video review of that if you want more in-depth thoughts, but this was an absolutely stunning book to me. Extraordinary study of the Levitical sacrificial system, and then a connection to what the Gospels are doing as they, portray Jesus, especially the Gospel of John portrays Jesus as that Passover lamb. This to me was and still is, I think about it a lot. I'm going to go back into it in the new year, I think, and reread some chapters. This book was a paradigm shift for me, a paradigm stretch and a paradigm shift for me. It confirmed a lot of intuitions I'd had, but he brought serious exegetical and scholarly muscle to it, especially his understanding and his discussion of what the Levitical priests were doing, and especially when he talks about here's what a kind of normal Israelite person walking into the temple with a sacrifice might have been thinking and experiencing. Really profound, really significant, and I think especially for more evangelical types, Protestant evangelical types, I think this book is going to be extremely challenging in a good way. So I can't more highly recommend Lamb of the Free. But I'll keep moving on. So Unmasking the Powers by Walter Wink. I have been, for several years now, had it a goal of mine to go through Walter Wink's famous trilogy on the Powers, and this is the second book. The first book is a lot more about, which I liked, but the first book was a lot more just about the language of powers in the New Testament. So if you don't know who Walter Wink was, he's a pretty famous biblical scholar, theologian, who this trilogy is one of his probably most impactful works on the language of powers and principalities in the New Testament, and how we might think about that in our current day. And so this is the second of the 3 books. I'm hoping to read the third one sometime in 2025, but anyways, the first of the trilogy was good, but it surprised me that it was mostly just about linguistics. It was a lot of just defining terms, like defining Greek terms and putting them in context, which is helpful stuff, but it wasn't the most like gripping reading. It was more just, work. This second book really turned a corner for me and started getting into some of the theological meat that I was interested in the whole time, and I loved it. And I also loved, in particular, one thing that surprised me about. So Walter Wink is someone that lots of people quote and lots of people critique and lots of people have responses to, which is a sign of how influential his work is. But I wanted to go back to the source because I wanted to get an unfiltered sense of what he was actually arguing. And I was surprised by how seriously he takes spiritual concepts. And I was also surprised by the global scope of his argument. So he really reaches outside of just North America or Western culture to support and buttress his ideas and his conclusions from the New Testament about how to think about the language of powers and principalities and kind of the spiritual conflict that in his view people are caught up in. And he really takes spiritual phenomena seriously and globally. And so I really loved it. And so I'm really excited to get into book 3. The first book was Naming the Powers. The second one that I'm talking about now is Unmasking the Powers. And I believe the third one is Engaging the Powers. I'm hoping to get to that one next year. Okay, this next one, another David Bentley Hart, another DBH appearance. That is Atheist Delusions. I love this book, and I think it's really unfortunately titled and branded. I wish it was. I wish they would reissue it and call it something different, because it's very much. It feels like an early 2000s like pop atheism. All those unfortunate polemical battles that were going on. So I think that's maybe why I never actually read it, because I just am never super interested in all of that. But I'm so glad I picked this book up and I read it, and I urge anyone who likes church history especially to pick this up and read it. I think it's one of the maybe more easy-to-read titles from David Bentley Hart, actually. And essentially what it is in a nutshell is he is pushing back. There's this pop notion of church history that, like, the world was progressing scientifically and culturally, and it would have progressed much further and faster if the church, especially the entrenched Roman Catholic European institution of the church, hadn't been suppressing scientific advancement and advancement in our understanding of humanity and the world. And like there's this pop notion that the church really held all that back, and it's not until the church power was toppled that the Enlightenment was liberated into making all the progress that we needed to make. This is rehashed by like people like Steven Pinker today, and kind of endlessly trotted out. And Atheist Delusions is a lightning bolt takedown of that view, which is just really bad history and just really, really bad, shallow understanding of what actually was going on in medieval Europe, and actually the ways that the church was in tandem. Like, it's a complicated history. It's a complex history. It's not simple like that rendering is. And David Bentley Hart I think he just blows all of the cobwebs off of those arguments, those old trot out arguments, and he puts a really fresh and just super enjoyable to read book that gives a much better understanding of church history along that whole argument. So I loved Atheist Delusions. Okay, another work of history here, God's Own Party by Daniel K. Williams. Daniel Williams is becoming one of my favorite historians of religion in America. God's Own Party, there's a pun there of GOP, talking about the Republican Party. This is a history of how the Republican Party got kind of Christianized, or Christians got Republicanized, however way you want to put that. It is, what I like about him so much is he's so thoughtful and very balanced, very careful in his rendering of history. So he does not, in my reading of him, he does not give in to any of the popular, shallow pendulum reactions in doing history that a lot of other historians might be tempted to, especially to sell books. He does really careful work, but he's also very confident. I think because of his careful work, he's very confident to point out where things took turns and figures who made decisions that kind of this unfortunate unification of right-wing politics and popular evangelicalism. And I've read a good bit of kind of how that alliance has happened. I mean, there's so many people who've written about it, but Daniel K. Williams, because of his care and because of his unwillingness to engage in shallow polemics or shallow takedowns, he's becoming one of my most trusted sources on that topic. And God's Own Party is an excellent piece of historical reporting, historical study that keeps a pretty broad view. It doesn't dive into any particular sub area of study. It really looks at a broad, how did this happen, especially over the 1900s? Like, how did this happen, and how did the whole kind of trajectory look? And so if you're interested in that, definitely highly recommend God's Own Party. Oh man, this next one. This is a hard one to recommend. It's kind of a hard one to recommend, but it's Side by Side, which was written by Prime, which I believe stands for Peace Research in the Middle East. So like a lot of people, after October 7th happened in Israel, I wanted to do some reading to understand what was going on, the history of that part of the world. And so this was one of the books I was recommended, and I picked it up. This is a extremely unique book in what it is and how it's put together. And so briefly, it's essentially what this institute did that put this book together was they gathered two teams of historians, one Israeli and one Palestinian. So there's a team of Israeli historians and a team of Palestinian historians who both wrote histories of their people, so the Israeli history and the Palestinian history. And then they put them together in this book, but they put them together literally side by side, page for page. So you'll read a page, and they're facing each other. So on the left side, I believe on the left side is the Palestinian account, and the right side is the Israeli account. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you'll be reading about events, and then on the facing page is the other historical team's rendering of the same events. And so you work through. It's a hard book to read because of the format in some ways, and also because it's really head-spinning because you're reading one side's understanding of how an event unfolded, and then you're reading the other side's understanding of how an event unfolded, and they might be taking different historical conclusions and judgments. So it's very challenging. It took me a while to work through, but it really stretched my understanding of the history of that region of the world. And I don't give it 5 stars because of the love of the reading experience. I give it 5 stars because of, I guess, the importance of the project and because of how much it shines a light on how complicated the history is. And so that's side by side. I do recommend it if you really want to sink into a complex situation. Okay, let's keep going here. Wholeheartedness by Chuck DeGroat. Chuck DeGroat is becoming one of my favorite writers on mental health, the health of the interior emotional world, especially for leaders and pastors. This book, I'm going to keep this short because I think the reason I gave this book 5 stars is because of the season of life in which I read it. It spoke just piercingly and directly to some of the tiredness or exhaustion I had experienced in ministry leadership, and he spoke a very healing word to it. And so I'm not going to belabor kind of my thoughts on that because some of it is personal, but I really loved it. I love Chuck DeGroat's gentle and honest and humble voice. I really appreciated all the books I read by him, and this one was one of my favorites. So that's Wholeheartedness. And then this is another little one, Reading for Preaching by Cornelius Plantinga. Very short book. I love reading. I'm also a preacher, and so I'm interested in books that talk about the intersection of those things. And this book was, more than anything, fun and encouraging and smart and wide-ranging. So he just argues that a life of wide and deep and engaged reading is going to build you up as a preacher in lots of surprising ways beyond just researching points for your talks, for your sermons. And so I just found it super encouraging, super validating, super inspiring. It inspired me to push into some other areas of reading that I don't typically read, like poetry, for example. And so I loved it. And that's Reading for Preaching by Plantinga. Back to Daniel K. Williams again, Defenders of the Unborn. This is kind of a subset of his earlier book, God's Own Party. This is specifically about, underneath the broad umbrella of kind of the religious right, this is about the pro-life movement specifically. And what I loved all the things I said earlier about him, the balance, the care, the careful reporting and study and writing, that's all here. But I also love the ways he has a broad lens on this, and he actually looks at more of what we would consider, historically we would consider more of a progressive pro-life movement. He brings that into the story and talks about how the grounds upon which the progressive pro-life movement stood and how the whole thing eventually coalesced and turned in more of a rightward direction. Very, very insightful and really brings a level of nuance to the popular understanding of what we see as the pro-life right-wing movement today. So deeply challenging, but deeply, deeply helpful book, Defenders of the Unborn. Another study on evangelicalism, Evangelicals Incorporated by Daniel Vaca. I loved this book. This is another really insightful historical study, but it's about the book industry. It's about, particularly in the early 1900s, it's really weighted more towards the early 1900s, things like the Scofield Bible, the Bible Conference movement, all of that stuff. But this is just a really, really enlightening look at the power of the book industry and the amount of kind of culture shaping impact it had when it comes to evangelicalism as we understand it today. And so it's a really maybe not an area that most people would consider if they're thinking about the history of evangelicalism and the shape it's taken. But that's part of what makes this book so interesting and good and insightful, is that he's kind of uncovering an angle of culture and history that not many people would consider to look at. So I really loved it. And just as someone who's interested in books, I also found that the history super, super fascinating. So that's one I would highly recommend if you share any of those interests. That's Evangelicals Incorporated. Oh man, okay. This is a hard turn. Late Admissions. This one was published this year. This is Glenn Lowry's autobiography, memoir. This is quite a reading experience. I like Glenn Lowry. I don't follow him devotedly, but I like him, and I tend to listen to his podcasts. I think he's a really interesting voice. I think he's a kind of an amazing rhetorician, and his way of responding carefully intelligently but also passionately to what's going on in our culture is really inspiring to me. And so I picked this book up just because I like him, and it is a wild story. And he tells his story in a bracing way. It's very open, and it's really humble in my reading of it. It's very humble, very willing to acknowledge mistakes, and even acknowledges no other memoir that I know of has done this, where the intro to the book he basically says, in what follows, I am wrestling with the fact that I'm trying to tell you a story to get you to think a certain way about me. And I'm trying to be humble so that you trust me. And I'm trying to be vulnerable so that you trust me, but I recognize that I have a goal in making you trust me. I mean, that's the style of the book. He opens with that admission. Late Admissions is the title. He opens with that admission and then takes you through his story, which is a wild, wild story. Really surprised me in so many ways. And so just as a sheer reading experience, it gripped me and took me through. Got me to the last page really quick because I was just so absorbed by it. So that's Late Admissions. All right, just shifting back into biblical studies now. Paul and the Resurrection of Israel by Jason Staples. I did a video review of this too, so I won't belabor this one either. But this is another paradigm shifter for me. It really permanently affected the way I read texts like Romans and Galatians. His assertions about the way that Paul is differentiating the term Israel versus Jew in his texts is very convincing. His historical kind of look at the extra biblical texts also supports his argument. And it just it's hard to, because it sounds so dry and academic. It's hard to describe how powerful the reading experience of this book is. It is very academic, but and scholarly. But man, it really, really is another lightning bolt into how we read some New Testament letters from Paul and how Paul understood what God was doing through Christ in the Mediterranean world at the time, especially the history of Israel kind of losing 10 of its 12 tribes and what Paul believed God was doing through Christ in that, to sum up that entire history. It's a remarkable, remarkable, remarkable book. Absolutely adore it. All right. History and Eschatology by N.T. Wright. I'm going to try to march on here. We're getting near the end. History and Eschatology by N.T. Wright. I like N.T. Wright a lot. Read a lot of pages from him. I have come to view N.T. Wright as an extremely effective synthesizer. I don't read him as much anymore to do deep exegetical, careful, precise work, but I see him as like a kind of magisterial synthesizer of big ideas and big kind of motifs and themes in the biblical canon. And I think he's and history, and he's like remarkably kind of good at synthesizing a lot of information. And this is one of my favorite things from him. They're his Gifford lectures, and it's just about the work of doing history and the kind of the eschatological pull of belief and faith. And what does that mean for the work of doing critical history, and what's the importance of critical history for the life of faith? It's an extraordinary set of lectures and a really, really wonderful book. One of my favorites from him, so it got 5 stars for me. Fundamentalism in American Culture by George Marsden. I've talked about this in some of my videos on fundamentalism lately. So this is, I think, a gold standard on understanding the rise of fundamentalism, what the antecedents of fundamentalism are in America, why that matters. He's an amazing historian, but he also, in the 3rd edition, which I read, he actually brings his thesis up to the Trump era, which is really, really interesting. And he just does this. It's extremely clarifying and insightful to see the trends that created fundamentalism in the early 1900s and some similarities and parallels in what's happening today. Light bulbs just go off for me as I read this book over and over and over again, and so I absolutely love it. I think it's really, really important, kind of seminal historical study. So that's Fundamentalism in American Culture by Marsden. Another book that I think is going to be a seminal book is A World After Liberalism by Matthew Rose. This is a work of kind of political theory, political history on the alt-right of all things. And what sets this book apart and what gives it 5 stars, it's short and readable, first of all. But what Matthew Rose does is he kind of surveys, I think it's 5 philosophers, like careful, deep thinkers from across a 100-year span, 150 years, that provide the kind of intellectual seedbed for what would become like the hard right, nationalistic alt-right. But what's so helpful about this book is that he takes these thinkers seriously. He has like major issues with them philosophically or politically, but he takes them seriously on their own merits and does his best. And I think he does an extremely successful job at presenting their thought for what it was. He doesn't try to provide rejoinders or whatever. He just says, this is what these people were arguing, and this is the context in which they argued it. And it really clicked for me as to think like, oh, this is what the alt-right comes from. These are the intellectual forebears of it. And to understand really what's going on in the populist right-wing nationalistic kind of wave that's really, really been roiling around the globe, I think Matthew Rose's book is really extremely helpful. So that's A World After Liberalism. All right, reading the Psalms as Scripture. I did a video review of this, so I won't say a lot here, but this book, one of the shortest books I've read this year, and back to that whole page for insight ratio, this is one of the highest. Really loved how much punch is in this book for such a small package when it comes to understanding what the Psalms are doing, and especially how they fit in the kind of literary composition of the biblical canon. The idea of the seams between the different movements of the Psalter and how they're recapitulating the story of David or Israel. It's just kind of mind-blowing if you've never thought of the Psalms that way. It's a really, really awesome little lightning bolt of a book. And continuing on, The Mythmakers by John Hendricks is a beautiful, exquisite, beautiful, graphic, nonfiction book. It's unlike any other book I think I know of, but it's about the friendship of Lewis and Tolkien. And it's illustrated beautifully and powerfully and creatively and playfully. But seriously, and the homework he did behind it really impressed me. The research he did impressed me. I've done a lot of reading on Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings, and he just brings it together in a package that this book, more than any other book I read, emotionally impacted me. I put it down with tears in my eyes because of the way he ends it and the kind of the imaginative coda he adds to their friendship. And so I adored this. I was blown away by it. I wasn't sure what to expect when I picked it up, and I found myself loving it more than a lot of other things that I've read this year. So that's The Mythmakers. Four more to go. You're Only Human by Kelly Kapic is a really great book about theological studies around anthropology. So the thesis of the book is embracing human limit, and he brings in the incarnation to that theologically. He argues that there's a difference between sinfulness and limitations, and we need to stop thinking our limitations are sinful and actually think our limitations are good in the sense that they're places to experience God and experience community in others. And it's just really profound. It's also a popular level, so it's not hard to read. I really loved it. The chapter on time, how people experience time, is better than a lot of whole books I've read on that topic. His one chapter there. So I really adored Kelly Kapic's book, You're Only Human. Dave Bentley Hart, one more time. I did a video review of this, but All Things Are Full of Gods. I think it's an extraordinary book on consciousness and the mysteries of life, and it's in a wonderful format, a surprising format that is funny and moving and extremely intellectually challenging and rigorous and robust. I think he knocked it out of the park in terms of an argument against kind of rigid naturalistic accounting of human consciousness and what it means to be a person. So check out my video review if you want more on that, but that's an amazing, amazing book. All right, two more. The Pastor Theologian by Gerald Heastan and Andrew Wilson, or Todd Wilson. I think it's Todd Wilson. I'm blanking. This is another personal one for me. I'm a pastor who has wrestled with kind of the academic theological side of what I believe I'm called to do. And this is a short little book that's kind of lightning clarity on the history of the role of a pastor as a theologian and a visionary call for pastors to stay as pastors but be academic theologians in the pastorate. And so this is a personal thing for me, may or may not track with you, but I found it deeply resonant. It confirmed a lot of my intuitions about myself and my role and what I'd love to see in my vocation. And it just gave me practical kind of challenges and ways to move forward on it. So that's The Pastor Theologian. Really love that book. I'm going to absolutely keep it on my shelf. And then lastly, the most recent book I read that I gave 5 stars is Circle of Hope by Eliza Griswold. This is a remarkable piece of journalism. She tells the story of a church that over time kind of fractured around issues of kind of social justice, race, inclusion, all of that stuff through the lens of these 4 pastors that all worked in the same kind of network of churches in Philadelphia. But what this book is amazingly written. It's empathetically written, and she portrays these 4 it's like really through the lens of these 4 pastors' lives. She was up close and personal with them over time, did extremely careful reporting research work, and she portrays them all as humans with their foibles and flaws and realisms, and empathetically engages the reader into their lives. And I don't know. I just thought this was such a window on human experience, the experience of the church and our culture. It's also a window onto some of the most pressing like cultural issues we have that are like fragmenting so many communities. And there's no like shallow moralizing about it. It's just tells the story, and it gives you an inside look at how this could play out. And I put it down and I thought, I can imagine this playing out in so many places. And it's so many fraught topics, so many impassioned ideas. I just thought it was a really extraordinary piece of reporting and writing that's going to stick with me for a long time. So those are all the 5-star books that I read this year. Now it's time for me to name my book of the year. I've wrestled with this. This is just my little corner of the internet, so kind of I'm probably overinflating even how important it is to do this, but I think what I have to do at the end of everything, the book that has probably challenged me the most, the book I'm most likely to return to the soonest, is Lamb of the Free by Andrew Riera. I think this is my book of the year. There were close runners up, but this is the one that has left the most indelible impact on my thinking. It's the one that I am the most excited to go back to. It's the one that I've probably told the most people to read. In my kind of my personal circles, and it's the one that's had immediate impact on my life in terms of my teaching and my understanding of Scripture. And it's just challenged me probably the most, and I appreciated the angle he took the most. I think that it struck that balance of inviting writing, challenging arguments, but also backed up with extraordinarily careful study. And so for me, this is just a summation of so many things that I love about reading. And that's my book of the year to Andrew Riera, and The Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death, a book that I absolutely adored, and I'm going to keep on my shelf for a long, 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 long time. So if you've watched this whole thing, wow, thank you for hanging with me. My ranting about books that I love is my favorite thing to talk about books, and so this is a chance for me to do that and hopefully share some titles with you that you might get inspired to read. If you have read any of these, if these stir up recommendations for you that you think I would like to read or review on this channel, please post away, react. I'd love to read and see what you are thinking about in reaction to all these. So as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.